All right, welcome everyone for today's session. I'm Andrea, your host for today's webinar. Before we start the presentation, I'd like to thank you all for making hardwear.io USA 21 a success. I know that many of you who come regularly to the webinars have been there for the conference, and it was very nice to see you there. Currently, we are working towards the physical hardwear.io Netherlands that we will have between the 25th and the 29th of October. The call for papers, the registration for the training and the conference is open, and I will share the links in the chat box later during the webinar. Without further ado, I will welcome Oleksii, who will present SpecFuzz, bringing Spectre-type vulnerabilities to the surface. Oleksii is a PhD student at TU Dresden in the systems engineering group. His primary field of research is system security, especially side channel and microarchitectural attacks, including recent Spectre and Meltdown. In today's webinar, Oleksii will cover Spectre-type attacks and SpecFuzz, which is the first tool that enables fuzzing for such vulnerabilities. Before we start the presentation, I would like to do a little housekeeping. As usually, the presentation will take 30 minutes, followed by a 10-minute Q&A. And if you have any questions, please type them in the chat box and we will answer them after the presentation is complete. As usually, we record a webinar and upload it later on our YouTube channel. And Oleksii, I would like to invite you to start your presentation now.
All right. Thank you for the introduction. Share the screen. Just a quick check. Can you see it, the screen?
Yes, everything's perfect.
Yeah, okay, perfect. All right, thanks again for the introduction, and let's begin. So the topic of my talk today is Spectre. It's a vulnerability that was discovered 4 years ago. It impacts most of the existing computing systems, those that are based on high-performance CPUs, and yet this vulnerability still stays largely unpatched in the systems. Specifically, in my talk, I will focus on the first version of Spectre, Spectre v1, also known as bounce check bypass, but the ideas that I present, they will be applicable to other versions of Spectre as well. And yeah, so first, let me remind you what is Spectre. Consider this snippet of code. Here, at the last line, we have a potential for a bounce, for a buffer overflow. It's an array access with an index, with a variable index. The only thing that prevents this buffer overflow is the conditional branch that we have right before this array access. So if this conditional branch is here, then we won't have the vulnerability. Otherwise, we might have a buffer overflow in here. However, if you execute this program on a modern high-performance CPU, such as Intel x86 CPU, they implement so-called branch prediction. What happens there is that when it takes a long time to execute this conditional branch, this part of code, the CPU might make a prediction on the outcome of this branch and start executing the next lines of code speculatively. So let's say in the past, this branch was executed several times, and all of this time it resolved to a true condition. So this branch was faulty and the memory access was executed. The CPU will record this history, look at it, and may predict that this time again it will resolve as true. However, notice that right now it's actually a wrong prediction because the value of x is 100, which is greater than 10, obviously, and yeah, it shouldn't follow this branch. And yet the CPU speculatively starts executing it. So it will speculatively read from memory and maybe even produce some more computations that follow this array access. So what speculatively means, it's a special type of execution in the CPUs where the CPU doesn't propagate results to the software visible level, but rather it keeps all the results internally until the prediction is resolved. So later, the CPU will see that the prediction was wrong. It will discard all the results, and the results of the computation will actually be correct because it throws away the wrong prediction. But this speculative execution might make some microarchitectural changes. For example, it may evict some cache lines, it change the state of the cache of the maybe memory management unit or some other parts of the CPU. And the attackers, which have access to the same hardware. So for example, we might run in a cloud environment where several tenants, several mistrust in co-tenants of the hardware, they share this hardware. And such attackers might be able to read these hardware traces, so the traces of the speculative execution, and leak some of the program secrets. So this is the essence of bounce check bypass of Spectre. Notice that here we have effectively a memory safety violation, so a buffer overflow in this case, but the one that happens not in during normal execution, but rather during speculative execution. Now, what has been done to prevent this vulnerability, to patch it? On the hardware level, the CPU vendors, they declared that it's a very important optimization, branch prediction that is, and they are not going to disable or patch in any way, at least in the near future. So Spectre, at least this version of Spectre, it will be a software issue, or rather, the issue of dealing with Spectre and preventing Spectre, it's a task of the software layer. Now, if we look at the software layer itself, there the picture varies from one application to another. So if you look at the browsers, for example, at Chrome, they did implement quite a few measures. So for example, Chrome implements site isolation to isolate different tabs in a browser one from another, even microarchitecturally. They also reduced the readings of timers and implemented several other measures. They do not completely prevent Spectre, but at least they raise the bar for the attacker, so they make the attack harder. However, it gets worse if we look at other applications. For example, in the Linux kernel, if you look at it, only about 170 branches, so conditional branches in all of the code base of the Linux kernels were protected. So you understand that it's a tiny margin of all the code base. 170 branches in all of Linux kernel, it's almost nothing. It's a very small portion of it. And if we look at other applications, for example, Graphene SGX, which is a security-critical library for Intel SGX enclaves, there they implemented nothing. So they still do not have any protection against bounce check bypass in this library, even though it's a security-critical library. And it goes on and on and on. So the patches there are very few patches, and they are present only in a very few applications. Now, why is it the case? Why do we see so little adoption of these patches or mitigations against Spectre? On one hand, the issue is the performance cost of these mitigations. So if we look at the state of the art right now, even the best, the fastest solutions, they cause the overhead of about 50%. So the application becomes about 50% slower with the patches applied. On the other hand, and which makes things even worse, many people consider side-channel attacks, including speculative vulnerabilities such as Spectre, they consider them as low-risk vulnerabilities. And that's why they are not willing to pay such a high performance cost to patch a low-risk vulnerability. And this motivates the goal of our work with SpecFuzz, which was to make the defenses more affordable. That is, we want to reduce the performance cost of defenses against Spectre, and this way to increase the chances of them being adopted in practice, in real life. And in the remainder of the talk, I will discuss how we implemented it, what are the ideas behind SpecFuzz, and what are the results that we got. And let's start with the key idea behind SpecFuzz. So our idea is to apply fuzzing, that is, to use fuzzing to detect vulnerabilities and patch only those parts of the application that are vulnerable to Spectre. Pretty simple. So first, to remind you what fuzzing is, it's a random testing approach where we take our program under test and we feed it with random inputs. So we send random inputs into the program and monitor its execution. If we see some kind of error, so for example, the program crashes or it hangs, or we find some other kind of violations, for example, memory safety violation, then we report it to the user. If we do not, we keep on doing it until we find an error. So we keep on sending new and new random inputs until we find an error. So that's the idea behind fuzzing. However, the problem is that fuzzing is not sufficient to find speculative vulnerabilities, because speculative execution is effectively invisible to software. So when the CPU executes a part of the code speculatively, it keeps all the results in its internal buffers and do not surface them to the software. So that's why software testing mechanisms such as fuzzing, they won't be able to detect Spectre. And here's where our approach comes to help. Our idea is to surface speculative execution. So we want to make speculative execution visible to software by simulating it. So we will simulate conditional branch misprediction in software, and this way we'll transform speculative execution into normal execution. And furthermore, since we are using fuzzing, we want to have good performance. So we cannot afford a full CPU simulator because it will be very slow, and we won't be able to test many random inputs, which is usually the requirement for fuzzing. That's why instead what we do, we simulate branch mispredictions within the application itself. We change the application such that speculative execution or simulation of speculative execution becomes a part of the application. And here's how it, and overall we call it speculative exposure, speculation exposure. And here's how it looks in practice. Consider this control flow graph. So you might imagine this being a function of some sort. So we have an entry point of the function, and then we have some kind of conditional branch. So the conditional branch with if and else. So this would be the if branch of the branch, and this would be the else part of it, and they merge in the end. So what we do to create this speculation exposure, we duplicate this entry node. We create an identical copy of this entry node, but we flip the condition of the branch. So when the original node would go into the if branch, the flipped version of it, the simulated misprediction, would go into the else part of the branch. Now this constitutes the simulation. That's how we introduce the simulation of branch mispredictions into the program itself. However, we need one additional step in here. The thing is that in real CPUs, this speculative execution, it cannot go indefinitely. It is always bounded to a certain so-called speculation window. On the CPUs that we tested, these were Intel Skylake CPUs, this speculation window is at most 250 instructions. In fact, it's a bit of over approximation. In practice, it's usually much smaller rather. But we over approximate it as 250 instructions. That is, after starting this simulation, we want to execute at most 250 instructions speculatively. To do this, before starting the simulation, we take a checkpoint of the program state, and we periodically check whether we reach this point of 250. And when we do reach it, then we roll back. So in the end, it will look like this. We enter the function, we execute the simulated misprediction of the branch, then we roll back after we reach the end of the simulation, and we execute the correct portion of the program. So as the result, with speculation exposure, we transform the speculative vulnerability, Spectre, into a conventional memory safety violation, for example, a buffer overflow. So that's the idea behind speculation exposure. We implement it in a tool that we call SpecFuzz. Here's what it does. So it builds on the idea of speculation exposure. We implement it in a compiler pass based on LLVM, which transforms this speculative execution into software visible normal execution. Now, on top of it, we also need to detect when the program can speculatively access invalid memory. So for this, we use conventional classical memory safety tool, AddressSanitizer. It's a tool for detecting memory safety violations. So in SpecFuzz, we combine speculation exposure with memory safety violation detection with AddressSanitizer. The workflow, accordingly, would be as follows. We take our original program that would be written in C or C++, or maybe some other language that is supported by LLVM. The program might contain a piece of code like this. For example, we might have a function that is actually identical to the example I showed in the beginning. So we again have a conditional branch and some potential buffer overflow that could happen speculatively. We compile this program with our compiler extension. So we compile it with LLVM that is extended to implement speculation exposure with SpecFuzz. And here's what it will look like. So if we look at this function in the assembly level, it will correspond to this function in assembly. So the conditional branch will look as compare and jump. So we compare the X value with the size, and then we jump if it's less than less. So we have this part. The array access will look like a move instruction. That's a lot in x86 assembly. And here's the storing of the result into the value of result. That's the blue part. So here's what SpecFuzz does. It changes this function on the assembly level as follows. So first thing that we do, at the beginning, we take a checkpoint of the program state. So we call a function that stores the program state. Then next, we add a conditional branch, or rather conditional jump, that has the opposite condition to the original one. So in the original program, we had if x is less than size, we insert a jump instruction, which has the opposite condition, jump if greater or equal. So this simulates branch misprediction. Now, we also periodically insert calls to a function that checks whether we should stop the simulation. So it checks whether we need to roll back. And to find out when we need to roll back, we also count how many instructions we executed during the speculation. So we have a counter, this instruction counter function, or rather variable, which we increment every time we execute a sequence of instructions by how many instructions we executed. So we here executed 2 instructions. That's why we increment the counter by 2. When this counter accordingly reaches a certain threshold, let's say 250 instructions, then we roll back, jump in here, and after this jump, we roll back the program state, so cancel all the changes to the program state, and continue normal execution from the original branch. The final part in this is to actually detect memory safety violations, buffer overflows, for example. For this, we use AddressSanitizer, and here's what it does. Before reading from memory, this part, we check the address from which we read with AddressSanitizer. So it checks whether this is a valid pointer and whether the program is actually allowed to read from this pointer. And that's the whole thing. That's how SpecFuzz works in practice. Now, when we have this instrumented binary that simulates branch mispredictions, the next step is to fuzz it. So when we fuzz it, we get an output like this. It's a long sequence of different violations. It doesn't really matter what it says here. It's just a list of detected memory safety violations. And in practice, since most programs are not, well, in fact, almost all programs are not written with Spectre in mind, we will find very, very many violations. This list actually goes on and on and on and on. So it's not practical to work with this manually. So it wouldn't be viable for a human to just go through a list of all these violations and try to patch them in the program. So for this, we have an additional step, an analyzer that analyzes the program, takes this list of vulnerabilities detected, and transforms them into a more human-readable form. So here's an example output from the analyzer. Here we have an instance of Spectre found in OpenSSL. It shows the location of the vulnerability that we found. So this is the location in the file where we found the line of code where it was found, and also it shows some additional metadata as a location. For example, the location of the vulnerability in the binary, the overflow offset, so how far this invalid access went from the original objects, and some additional metadata such as a branch sequence and so on. And from this, we get a list of vulnerabilities. However, when we tried it in practice, in real life, with real applications, we found that even this is not sufficient. We need one additional step. And the problem here is that this list of vulnerabilities is way too long, way too large. So here's what we found by testing several applications. So here we have one parsing library, one compression library broadly, another parsing libraries, so several libraries, including OpenSSL. And the numbers here are the number of vulnerabilities that we found after 24 hours of fuzzing them with the SpecFuzz instrumentation. As you see, the numbers are pretty large. So it's again wouldn't be really possible for a human, and nobody would want to go through 2,000 different potential vulnerabilities in OpenSSL, go through each of them, find them in the code, analyze whether it's a valid vulnerability or whether it's worth patching or not, and write in manually the patch for it. It's way too tedious. I don't think anybody is going to do it in real life. So to deal with this issue, we implemented one additional step, which is automated patching. So here the idea is to take this list of potential vulnerabilities produced by SpecFuzz and patch the application based on it. So we are kind of cleaning up the parts from the hardening, from the instrumentation of the program where we didn't find any vulnerabilities. So for this, what we did, we took two existing techniques that can automatically patch the whole application. So they would go through all the branches in the program and somehow protect them against Spectre. So we have two different techniques. One of them is adding L-fences. L-fence, it's an instruction that basically stops speculative execution. If we add it after a conditional branch, then no speculative execution will happen afterwards. It's a serializing instruction. And there is another approach called speculative load hardening. It applies a more sophisticated technique, but the effect is the same. It stops speculative execution where it's necessary. So we take these two existing mechanisms that protect all the conditional branches, and we change them to accept this list of vulnerabilities produced by the fuzzer. So what we did is or rather, with this modified patching techniques, we give them the application and a list of found vulnerabilities, and they would harden only those parts of the applications where we found a vulnerability during fuzzing, or also those parts of the application where we didn't actually test. Because with fuzzing, we normally don't have 100% coverage. We do not usually test the whole application, but only a part of it. So accordingly, if we didn't test a part of the application, we didn't have even a chance to find a vulnerability there, and we have to conservatively protect it as well. So that's the idea behind automated patching. And the complete workflow would be with one additional step. So we first analyzed, produced a list of vulnerabilities, and now we automatically patch them with this technique. And in the end, we get a protected, hardened binary application. Now, there is one more complication if we try to apply this technique in practice, because and it's nested simulation. The problem is that the CPUs, they can have several mispredictions in a row. So here's an example. Let's say we again have the control flow. It's actually very similar to the previous one, except we have some loops in here. And this blue line, it's the correct flow through this control flow. So let's say it could be a function. We fed it with some input value, and this function should be executed like this, from node A to B to D. After a single misprediction, the control flow might look like this. So we have here a conditional branch of some sort. This might be mispredicted, and instead of going to node B, the node A follows into node C. So that's our own control flow path. But here, during this speculative incorrect execution, we have more conditional branches. So here we have another fork in the control flow path. So here we might jump either again to the node C or node B, and these conditional branches could be mispredicted as well. So we might have them mispredictions in a nested fashion. So we might have a misprediction like this, then we might have a misprediction here as well, and so on and so forth and so forth. So, and if we try to actually simulate that, we would have to go through all possible combinations for each conditional branch in the program. So every time we encounter a conditional branch, we would have to test single misprediction, 2 mispredictions, 3 mispredictions, 4 mispredictions, and so on and so forth. So it basically creates a state explosion and makes the whole approach not feasible in practice. But what we found in practice is that it's actually not that big of a problem in real life. And here's what we base this observational. So this table, it shows the results of fuzzing, again, these the same 6 libraries, the same as in the previous table. So again, we have some parsing libraries, compression libraries, OpenSSL, and so on. And and the numbers here, they show the number of vulnerabilities detected during fuzzing, again, after 24 hours of fuzzing. But we divided them by how many branch mispredictions were necessary to find this vulnerability. So the first row shows the number of vulnerabilities that were detected with only a single misprediction per branch. Order 2 is with 2 mispredictions per branch and more, then with 3 mispredictions, and so on and so forth. And if you look closely at the numbers, you will see that most of the vulnerabilities we found with only a single misprediction. Then, with 2 mispredictions, we found slightly less. With 3 mispredictions, even less, and so on and so forth. And after basically 6 mispredictions at a time, we haven't found any. We stopped finding new vulnerabilities, which implies that it makes sense to concentrate most of the testing effort on single mispredictions, slightly less effort and slightly less testing time on 2 mispredictions, and so on. And the more mispredictions, the less time and it makes sense to spend on it. And we implemented in what we call prioritized simulation. So here the idea is that we change the number of mispredictions for every input. So in all inputs during all fuzzing rounds, we test with a single misprediction. In every second round of fuzzing, we test with 2 mispredictions. Every fourth round of fuzzing, we test 3 mispredictions, and so on and so forth. So we kind of spend most of the time on shallow mispredictions, so to say, but we occasionally go deep. That's the idea here. Now, finally, what are the results? How good do we get, and does SpecFuzz achieve the goal that we wanted to achieve? So here we measured the speed up, that is performance improvement with regard to full hardening. So here we measured the runtime of several applications that are protected against Spectre. We measured the runtime with complete hardening, so all conditional branches were hardened against Spectre. And we calculated and also measured the runtime with the only partial hardening based on the fuzzing results, so with the automated fuzzing, and we calculated the ratio. So that this would be the speed up, how much faster the application becomes, the protected application becomes, if we apply only partial patching based on the results of fuzzing. We again tested the same libraries, the same applications. And here we have 2 bars. The left bar, the green bar, is fuzzing with, or the patching with the LFences, so by adding a serializing instruction. And the blue bar, it's patching with the SLH. It's another approach for automatic patching. So we have 2 different approaches, and we calculate the ratio, the speed up that we get from SpecFuzz. So how much better the performance becomes after we apply SpecFuzz. And as you see, the results differ. And the main reason why the results differ is, well, basically we have 2 reasons. One reason is coverage. So for example, in OpenSL, we reached relatively low coverage. It was about 20%. So we tested only about 20% of the whole library. And accordingly, we had to protect everything in the parts of the application that we didn't test. So 80% of OpenSL was completely protected. And accordingly, the improvement wasn't very large. So we didn't get that much speed up here. On the other hand, if you look at Jasmine, it's a parsing library for JSON. There it's a relatively small library, and we managed to get almost complete coverage of this application. And on top of it, we found relatively few vulnerabilities in it, actually very few vulnerabilities in it. That's why we had to patch only a few branches in the whole application, and the improvement is very considerable. So the protected application, the protected library became for LFense 11 times faster. For SLH, it became 4 times faster, which is quite noticeable. Anyway, the second question, we might ask an interesting question. So we found this many vulnerabilities. Are all of them dangerous, and what are these vulnerabilities? For this, we subdivided them into several groups, into several categories. The first category would be the applications that we find the most dangerous and the most impactful. These are the vulnerabilities where this speculative memory access, it can change the control flow of the program. So let's say we have some function pointer in memory. So a pointer that, that points to a location of a function, and we have an indirect function called there. With a branch misprediction, this invalid memory access may override this function pointer, and accordingly, a wrong function will later be called. So it completely changes the control flow of the program, and the attacker might change the actual semantics of the program. That's why we consider them the most dangerous. Fortunately, we found very few instances of such vulnerabilities, and here are the numbers. Then the rest of the vulnerabilities that we found, these are instances where the attacker could speculatively either read or write into an invalid memory location, just data read or write. We further subdivided them into the cases where the attacker can control the address where to read or write from, and where the attacker cannot. So the controlled ones is where the attacker can control the address and basically dump at least a small slice of memory. Out of these, as you can see, it's about a quarter are controlled. The rest are uncontrolled. So the attacker can read only from a fixed location in memory, although it's an invalid one. And for the rest, we didn't have enough information to decide. So we required actually some data to make this, to make this classification. Now, the final question that we asked is how much time is necessary for fuzzing to find these vulnerabilities? And here's the plot that answers this question. So on the x-axis, we have the duration of fuzzing. So how long was the fuzzing campaign? And on the y-axis is the number of vulnerabilities detected during this fuzzing campaign or after the fuzzing campaign. So here, for example, the point is the number of vulnerabilities. It's slightly less than 2,000 that was detected in OpenSSL after about 1 hour of fuzzing. This is after 4 hours of fuzzing. And yeah, what can we say from it? So already after 1 hour of fuzzing, we found most of the vulnerabilities. And in fact, if we take very small libraries, for example, just me, here's this one. So this corresponds to this line. We already found all the vulnerabilities so we stopped finding new vulnerabilities after 1 hour of fuzzing. For slightly larger libraries, so take, for example, this YAML parsing library, this light blue line, we kept on finding new vulnerabilities up to 4 hours, but stopped afterwards. And for very large libraries, such as OpenSSL, we continued finding new and new vulnerabilities as time went on and on and on. So even after 32 hours of fuzzing, we kept on finding new vulnerabilities. Although still after the first hour, we found most of them in the first hour. So yeah, it says that based on these results, we can say that even with short fuzzing campaign, we can find quite a lot. Yeah, and with this, I want to conclude my talk. I hope that our work will make the defenses against Spectre more appealing for practical uses. As you saw, the performance of defenses becomes better, although it depends on the application, but overall it becomes considerably better compared to full hardening. And we hope that this performance improvement make the defenses against Spectre more viable in practice and increase their adoption in real life. And if you are interested in trying this tool out in practice on your own, then here's the link on GitHub. The source code is publicly available. And if you have any questions after the talk, then feel free to write me. Here's my handle on Twitter, or you can write me an email or to one of my co-authors as well. And with this, I want to thank you for your attention. And yeah, any questions?
Thank you very much, Oleksii, for the presentation. Actually, we have quite a few questions. So I think I will start with the first one. Ravi is asking, does this vulnerability affect all the architecture? I mean, AMD as well? And if not, how do they deal with branch prediction?
This vulnerability affects not only Intel, but well, this vulnerability affects all CPUs that implement branch prediction, which includes Intel CPUs, AMD CPUs. As far as I know, most of the ARM CPUs, pretty much everything that is not a tiny CPU and that is available on the modern market.
And Ravi is also asking, is this fuzzing hardware level or software level?
It's fuzzing of the software, yes.
Thank you.
So you cannot find new, so you cannot find new hardware vulnerabilities with this approach. You can only find instances of an existing hardware vulnerability in software.
All right. Dave had a question. Is there any known malware infecting people's computers that uses Spectre?
As far as I know, not. But there are, I know of a few prototype implementations where it was used for it. Yeah. It was used as a part of an actual attack. So for example, there was an attack on Chrome browser that used some speculative vulnerability as one of its steps. Yeah.
Thank you. Dave had another question. How is the evildoer getting the random input into the library? Is it practical to change the input in some way to protect from Spectre?
Well, usually you do not have control over the input. And in fact, it doesn't have to be random. So this approach, it's a testing approach. You have control over the application. Let's say you're a software developer and you want to test your application, your software, whether it has Spectre in it and maybe protect it with this automated patching approach. So that's how you would do it. You would use Fuzzing, you would feed your application with random inputs and can detect it. So the attacker doesn't actually have to send random inputs. Usually the attacker knows what to send, and yeah, the attacker will construct a malicious input for that.
All right, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I see that Scott has a question. Do you account for nested mispredictions re-steering before the first branch resolves?
I'm not sure I understand the question. For the first branch resolves. Well, we account for. So if you mean, do we make a decision? So at least how I understand the question, whether we make a decision on whether to simulate nested misprediction before the branch is executed or afterwards, then the answer would be before. So it's more or less static. So at every, say, nth execution, we will go deeper into mispredictions. So at every execution, we will have a single misprediction, every second 2 mispredictions, and so on. So it's a more or less static decision.
Thank you. And I think the last question that we received is, do you have plans to integrate new Spectre variants into the fuzzer as this domain progresses?
Yeah, we would like to do that. That's an ongoing work. Yes.
All right. Are there any more questions? If yes, then please type them in the chat box. I don't think we have any more questions. No, all right. Well, then, thank you, Oleksii, for answering these questions and for the great presentation.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for having me.
It was a pleasure to have you with us. Friends, please don't forget to fill in the feedback form. I shared it on the chat box and it will also pop up after the meeting is over. And it would also be great if you would give a shout out on social media to Oleksii. I think that this concludes the webinar. Thank you all for attending. We hope you have learned and enjoyed this presentation. See you next time.